Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse, which will focus on corrective actions and investigation today. My name is Tom Delru. I'm the head of the office of the resident coordinator in Turkey, and I will be your moderator today. This is the second webinar in a series of two on prevention of sexual abuse, sexual exploitation and abuse. The first one focused on the prevention aspect. Today, we will look into corrective actions and investigation. And we are again lucky to have a panel of experts with a ton of experience in this domain. We will start the webinar with opening remarks by Ms. Daniela Cicella, who is the Deputy Representative of the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees in Turkey. And her opening remarks will be followed by a recap of the first webinar on prevention by Ms. Fatma Hajolu, who is the Humanitarian Program Manager for UNFPA in Turkey. Following that, Ms. Samira Mirza, who is an investigator and safeguarding lead in the International Rescue Committee, will share some good practices globally on investigation procedures. And following her presentation, we will have a questions and answer session during which several questions will be directed to the panel members. We have to apologize for Mr. Robert Basil, who was on the agenda as well. For emergency reasons, he's not able to join us for the time being. If he managed to join us, we will welcome him. But if Mr. Robert could not join, that means that we will have more time for questions and answers and discussion. And then the webinar will be closed with closing remarks by Dr. Hassan Matashami, who is the representative of UNFPA in Turkey. The chat box will not be active for conversations between the participants. However, you can use the chat box to post questions to the team, to the organizing team, and we will make a selection of questions to be answered by the panelists. So, without further ado, I would like to invite Daniela to give her opening remarks. And welcome again to everybody.
Thank you, Tom. Dear participants, dear colleagues, it is really a pleasure for me today to deliver these opening remarks to this very important webinar on the protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. An issue that more than probably others requires a constant alert, sense of responsibilities, actions from all of us in view of our individual but also collective commitment and accountability. The theme of today, sexual exploitation investigations and good practices, is actually very close to my heart, as I used to work before also as a UN investigator, dealing also with the investigation of sexual exploitation and abuse. And I can reassure you, as Samira will explain in more detail than me today, that the investigation of PSEAs are among the most difficult and complex investigations to be conducted, not only from the perspective of the survivors, but also from the investigation's perspective. And not only because we need to address also the protection needs of the survivors and the witnesses, but also because it's very complex to collect sufficient evidence, not only to establish a misconduct, but also to support the disciplinary measures. So our colleagues will, and Samira in particular, will elaborate a bit more on this. And that would give us, all of us, the sense of what an investigation of PSEA may entail. However, from my side, on these opening remarks, I would like to, as many of us will not be involved in investigation in the near future, I would just highlight some elements that will still see all of us responsible with respect to investigation of PSEA, in what actually we are expected to do, but also what we are not expected to do in order to support the investigations. When I say that we all have a responsibility to play, not as investigators, but definitely as a protection actors. And some of the previous webinar and the future webinars, they will focus a lot on what we can do, starting for the importance to report, of course, in allegation of misconduct, standard of conduct, to start from that all of us are expected to respect, but also the importance of management certain risk. So what actually I would like to mention is the fact that, and again, Samira will stress this, what is important in a PSEA, in an SCA investigation is not only the funding, the final funding, but also how an investigation is actually conducted. If there is any gap in the investigation process, the investigation funding could not be utilized either. So what is important for all of us is to be aware of it and to alert the responsible entities as soon as we have, of course, an information and allegation, and also not to take specific action unless directed or doing under an investigation process with the competent investigators, because this, as I mentioned, can affect. And we all know, I'm sure that all of us are committed to fight against impunity as well. So an important investigation plan is essential to fight against impunity. The other important element that I would like to stress, because really affects all of us, is what all of us can do when it comes to the protection of survivors and witnesses. There are a lot of good practices also in this respect. I'm not sure whether will be addressed directly, all of them, or maybe an opportunity for another discussion among all of us. But what it is important is that all of us in different functions, particularly all of us in the NGOs, UN agencies that deal with protection, we are all responsible of taking care of individuals we're expected to support and protect. So there are already existing mechanisms for GBV, there are existing mechanisms for case management that are expected to be activated. But what it is important to say, to be activated not only after an investigation, to be activated before, during and after an investigation. Let's see whether Samira will have the opportunity to touch upon this as well. If not, as I mentioned, might be an opportunity for further discussion in our future meetings. So to conclude our my opening remarks to you, I just would like to say that although investigations technically are for expert investigators, the protection from sexual exploitation and abuse is a responsibility for all of us. Is no longer others' job. All of us, we are and should consider ourselves protection actors in order to support those that we are mandated to protect and to support. So if not a specific direct responsibility that we might have for actually conducting an investigation, we are all actually committed and also we are accountable for that. So if not direct responsibility, from a functional responsibility, we need to look into accountability. And then we will discover even more and give value to our protection role in these important areas, which is the protection from sexual exploitation and abuse and the investigation of sexual exploitation and abuse. Thank you. And let's continue the webinar all together to listen to our next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. So, dear participants, we have good news. Mr. Robert Basil, the PSEA coordinator and advisor to the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General in Iraq, managed to join us. So, welcome, Robert. And Robert will, just like Mirza, share some good practices on investigation procedures, but with a specific focus on Uganda, Iraq, and Somalia. So the panel is complete. Thank you again, Daniela, for this succinct and very clear opening remarks to set the tone. Before we take the deep dive into good practice on investigation, we thought it was good for Fatma to give a recapitulation of the first webinar, which was more broadly focusing on the prevention in general. And following that, Samira will be able will take the floor to go more in detail on good practices on investigation procedures. Fatma, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you, Tim. I forgot to unmute my microphone. I am the only person who will speak in this panel in Turkish. I'm going to provide you information about what we discussed in the previous meeting on the 25th of November. My name is Fatma Hacıoğlu from UNFPA. I am the humanitarian program officer, and also I'm one of the focal points now sexual exploitation and abuse and prevention thereof at country office. I'm going to talk about PSEA network. I'm delivering this speech on behalf of the PSEA network. As mentioned by Tom, we organized 2 webinars at PSEA network, United Nations Turkey Prevention of Sexual Exploitation and Abuse network. In the first webinar, we focused on prevention of SEA. Sometimes I'm going to use the abbreviation PSEA or the Turkish correspondence of PSEA. Regarding PSEA, we discussed the concepts and definitions and its 6 core principles. We also discussed the implementing partners PSEA assessment and capacity development processes, and also United Nations Turkey country team network of PSEA. After the completion of the first webinar, now we are in the second webinar to talk about corrective actions and investigations. So I will talk about the terms and concepts about PSEA that we discussed in the previous webinar. Again, so that you know if these terms and concepts were discussed in the previous webinar. In the first webinar, these were the speakers. Alvaro Rodriguez, he is deputy resident coordinator of United Nations Turkey, and Sofia Pierre from IOM, responsible for PSEA on behalf of PSEA Network, Eda Özyurt from UNFPA, GBV and PSEA expert, and also from Support to Life Association quality consultant Özlem Yazlık Alkut participated as a panelist, and also in the last part of the first webinar, to recap, UNFPA Turkey representative Hasan Muhteşem took the floor. So regarding this webinar, of course, what I'm going to tell you is not the only discussion topic. You can find the recording of the first webinar from YouTube address of UNFPA. From this address, English and Turkish recordings are available and will be available, just like recording of this webinar. You can use this as a reference point, and also if you can disseminate it to your colleagues who may be interested in this one. So what was discussed? It was on Zoom and it was also streamed on YouTube. What was discussed? Basically, I will talk about what was discussed. I'm not going to give the details of every speech of the panelists, but in general, I'm going to tell you what we discussed. First of all, the definition of sexual exploitation and abuse was the most interesting part. As you know, sexual exploitation and abuse, when it is the matter of debate and discussion, sometimes it is very likely that it is confused with sexual harassment. I hope that this image will make you understand it more clearly. Sexual exploitation and abuse and harassment are part of gender-based violence. They are all forms of gender-based violence, but we are focusing on sexual exploitation and abuse as the main theme of the webinar. First, about sexual harassment. So when we talk about sexual harassment, what we need to know that this is done between, this occurs between the colleagues at the same workplace, the type of sexual assault. So it may be United Nations agencies, international NGOs, local NGOs. So this is happening between the colleagues of the same workplace. It is misconduct. On the other hand, sexual exploitation and abuse is different from that one. And basically, the service provider exerts such acts against the beneficiaries of services and support. And this is the act of misconduct. Actually, SEA is a form of violence, and also other actors, humanitarian actors, has improper use of position in this form of violence. And also, we have IASC, and there are 6 core principles of IASC. So for humanitarian employees and also all other actors providing support to the affected population. And I'm not going into details. There are 6 core principles that can be summarized the following way. SEA constitute acts of gross misconduct and are grounds for termination of employment. So no second chance should be given to these people. And also sexual activity with children younger than 18 years of age is prohibited. Exchange of money, employment, goods or services for sex is prohibited. I mean, you cannot offer money and employment and goods or services in exchange for sex. Of course, any sexual relationship with beneficiaries that involves improper use of position is prohibited. I mean, sexual relationship with the beneficiaries is prohibited. And 5, humanitarian workers are obligated to report any concerns regarding SEA by fellow workers. So we have the obligation to always report SEA. And 6, humanitarian workers, all of us, are obliged to create and maintain an environment which prevents SEA. So we should discourage SEA around us. I mean, while accessing and reaching out to beneficiaries of services, we should discourage sexual exploitation and abuse, and we should create an environment which is free of SEA. At this point, I'd like to talk about the Sexual Exploitation and Abuse Network. It was established in 2019 by the United Nations Turkey and is still active. This is the PSEA network. This network convenes on a monthly basis, and there are 12 member organizations, UN agencies. So a coordinated approach is provided to these members, and also to minimize the SEA risk by the records of these agencies. Whenever there is a case, it aims at providing effective response, and it also is responsible for raising awareness about the PSEA. And there are 4 main categories of work: management and coordination, engagement with and support to the affected population, and also prevention and response. Of course, in any case, distinguished participants, and this was also discussed in the previous webinar, including the UN agencies and also their implementing partners, if you observe any SEA case or any event of SEA, if you have that suspicion, we talked about reporting mechanisms, and we also showed these addresses where you can report these possible cases, potential cases. And you can find detailed information about the supporting mechanism from the recording of the first webinar. And also, after talking about the United Nations PSEA network, we discussed about our activities with implementing partners. And there was a guidance document, which was a protocol. This includes all the implementing partners. This is the United Nations Protocol on allegations on sexual exploitation and abuse involving implementing partners. This is referred to as IP protocol. And some institutions use the term implementing partners, some agencies use only partners or executive partners. Implementing partners are the organizations that directly work with United Nations, implement programs, CSOs, national organizations, other UN agencies, and public institutions and academia that implement the programs on behalf of the United Nations. So this implementing partner protocol outlines requirements for the United Nations working with the implementing partners to ensure adequate safeguards and appropriate action related to sexual exploitation and abuse. It also provides a main framework for the obligation. So in the framework of this protocol, the United Nations agencies and entities take a harmonized approach and implement the United Nations protocol for a common assessment, and also with the help of this common assessment to the capacity of the implementing partners will be assessed and scored based on the core standards and PSEA organizational policies and procedures to prevent and respond to PSEA, and then the gaps and areas of improvement of the partners are identified. Capacity building plan is developed according to this protocol. And after that, Support to Life Association delivered a presentation about a project self-assessment tool, implementing partner self-assessment process in PSEA on behalf of UNICEF, and they provide information about which steps they have taken and in which areas they built their capacity and with whom they collaborated for the implementation of certain policies. They shared their experience. After they shared their experience about PSEA, what tools they developed represented. Before showing those tools, I just would like to add another note. According to the United Nations Protocol, IP protocol, if an implementing partner is assessed by a United Nations agency, it is not going to be subject to another assessment when to work with another UN entity, because this is a common assessment tool. For that reason, the assessment of that organization can be used by the other UN agencies and UN entities. And these are these example tools which are shared on the website of the Support to Life Association. This is the information brochure on the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse against children. So this is in Turkish, Arabic, and Persian languages. And also the Support to Life Association, in collaboration with UNICEF, developed online training module. If you like, we can share the link of this online training, but I'm going to talk about these resources. So the panelists answers and comments were compiled in some of the resources. One of them is United Nations PSEA page, where you can find all crucial documents and vital documents on this web page. You can always visit this web page. Similarly, interagency standing committees, PSEA web page is another useful resource. On the other hand, as I showed before, you can find the posters and brochures of Support to Life Association.
Some information videos have been also shared, and they are among the resources. And also, as the United Nations PSEA group, we have some community-based messages. So again, we have UNICEF and Support to Life cooperation. They have simply translated and localized the whole training into Turkish. And these webinars, which we are doing now, are actually making a huge contribution to the field, because most of the resources are in English, and establishing a literature in Turkish is also of pivotal importance. So I try to give you a summary of the previous webinar, and now we are in the second one, and you will be able to access this on YouTube as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fatma. Thank you very much for this recap, which gives us a perfect setting for the second part of the discussion on investigation procedures for SEA cases. So I now welcome Samira, who will share some good practices on investigation procedures from a little bit different countries in the world. So Samira, I think you have 40 minutes. In case you would finish earlier, that would give us more time for Q&A. But yeah, if you could try to keep it to 40 minutes maximum, that would be great. So Samira, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tom. Fatima, are we okay with this? Yes, okay, great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Samira Mirza, and I'm an investigator and the safeguarding lead for the Ethics and Compliance Unit of the IRC. It's a great pleasure to be here today. Thank you, UNFPA, for inviting me to present on this very important topic. I will be speaking on the investigative approach that we employ when looking into allegations of safeguarding violations, with this focus of the do's and don'ts and based on best practice. We will have ample time for Q&A at the end, but without further ado, I'll just move forward. The IRC is committed to a survivor-centered approach when reviewing and investigating safeguarding violations. The principles that govern this approach include: 1, a survivor's right to be treated with dignity and respect and not be exposed to victim blaming in any form. 2 is survivor's right to privacy and confidentiality. And 3, the survivor's right to safety and well-being. The latter is the most paramount and our biggest concern throughout any safeguarding investigation. The survivor-centered approach is to support and promote the survivor's ability to identify and express their needs and wishes, as well as help reinforce their capacity to make decisions about any intervention that might aid in their recovery. Survivors themselves are often the ones who are best placed to understand their safety needs and the risks involved in their particular situation. And for that reason, we feel it's very important they have a voice in determining the response and support that they receive from us. The global reporting guidelines are quite clear in terms of our obligations to report safeguarding violations, although they differ slightly in terms of children versus adult clients. In the case of children, defined as anyone under the age of 18, the reporting guidelines are mandatory. That means that anyone who has any knowledge or concern about a safeguarding violation against a child, which is also clearly outlined in our child safeguarding policy, is required to report the matter using the reporting mechanisms available to them to report into our unit, the ECU, the Ethics and Compliance Unit. However, for adults, the mandatory reporting guidelines are modified to take into account the adult survivor's ability and their right to consent. This means that adult survivors can decide whether or not to make a report, whether or not to participate in an investigation, and how that investigation might move forward. In essence, it is requested that safeguarding violations against adult clients be reported, but it is not mandated. IRC staff members who are aware of safeguarding concerns or violations against adult clients, where it is safe and where it is possible, should seek their informed consent prior to making a report on their behalf. If this consent is provided, we will move forward. If it is not provided, we will do our best to reach out to the adult client to ensure they are informed about support services, and which I'll go into later, as well as remind them that they can change their mind at any point. There is no timeline for reporting these violations. There are only 2 exceptions to the requested but not mandatory guidelines when it comes to adult clients in terms of obtaining consent. We will, we overstep this. 1, if the adult is an IRC staff member in a location where the law, for example, requires that sexual harassment be reported, or 2, if the adult falls into the category of a vulnerable adult. And by that, we mean someone who may need additional support services by reason of a mental or other disability, their age, an illness. Someone who appears not to be able to take care of themselves or protect themselves against harm. And in that case, we don't make the decision as to who's vulnerable, who's not. That we leave up to the evaluation conducted by a protection specialist or somebody who is a disability inclusion expert and weigh in their findings. There are about 5 guiding principles that we employ in relation to safeguarding investigations. The first and foremost is consent, or rather informed consent. And I referenced that earlier. We consult with the survivor and or their caretakers in the event it's a minor when deciding to proceed with the investigation. And as opposed to other investigations, we conduct, let's say fraud or corruption, we tend to communicate far more with survivors of safeguarding violations. So for example, we'll explain the investigation process, we'll go over potential outcomes, we'll make every effort to respect their wishes, we will ensure we don't speak to anyone that might place them at greater danger. The second is confidentiality. We ensure confidentiality throughout the process, specifically the survivor's identity and the details of the complaint. For this reason, we do accept anonymous reporting as long as we have a way in which to correspond with the survivor, either through a made-up email, a phone number, or if they prefer to communicate through staff member or to us directly in another way. Welfare, we employ a trauma-informed approach, and by that I mean we know that there is great trauma for survivors who have faced safeguarding violations, and so we express empathy and ensure we have an understanding of their current needs and are able to provide whatever support. Their welfare must come above everything else. Best interest principle. Same as I highlighted under welfare, the safety, welfare, and the rights of the survivor must come above all other considerations. And where there's ambiguity as to what their best interest is, we will consult with a GBV specialist or a protection specialist on the ground for their guidance and analysis. Impartiality. We ensure that every survivor is treated with dignity and respect, despite their sex, their gender identity, their background, their ethnicity, their age, or the circumstance surrounding the allegations. We don't make any assumptions that might invite bias or allow for a shift in the objective approach that needs to be employed here. Additionally, we ensure we use neutral language and refrain from any implication that an allegation will be substantiated simply because we want to manage expectations and we are unsure at that juncture how the investigation will proceed. There are several phases to the IRC investigation cycle. ECU, the unit responsible for investigations, maintains a centralized case management system, Ethics Point, which includes all complaints submitted vis-a-vis our different reporting channels, whether it's our hotline, the web form we have online, email, or other means. Reporters can submit a complaint, as I mentioned, anonymously, as long as we have a way in which to communicate with them or obtain additional details through someone else. After that, we upload all of that information into Ethics Point. The second phase, Pillar B, is we triage and assign. So cases are typically assigned by risk level and priority, and all safeguarding matters are in the high risk category and to be actioned as quickly as possible. We are cognizant of the fact that a protracted investigation causes a lot of harm, particularly to survivors, but also other participants in the case. We assess the credibility of the allegation during the triage process, and that's a weekly meeting that we do within our team. We identify the potential breach of IRC's code of conduct or the breach of the organizational policy that we want to hold the subject accountable to. And we determine whether the complaint merits an investigation, whether it's a programmatic issue that needs to be resolved locally or appears to be an inquiry only. After that case intake meeting is held to review, prioritize, and assign the cases, it falls into basically three categories. The first is either we do the investigation ourselves remotely or on mission. We refer to HR, which is in the case of sexual harassment cases. We don't investigate sexual harassment. It is considered employee relations at IRC and so falls within their remit. Or we refer to the country program for investigation with a local investigation team. We have compliance coordinators all over the world, but we still provide oversight for that. One of the most important steps that we take, particularly in relation to safeguarding matters, is risk mitigation steps. We work with the country programs, or if it's in the US offices, to evaluate whether any risk mitigation steps need to be considered to ensure the safety and well-being of all participants in the investigation, as well as preserve the integrity of any evidence on hand if it is available. The first is safety and security, as I mentioned. So we usually work with either the regional security focal point or the local security focal point to identify the safety and security risks to the survivor, any witnesses, the subject. We consider how that risk will be managed and monitored throughout the investigation process, and in the case of the survivor, even after the investigation has concluded. We also consider the status of the subject. Given the allegations, will the subject be placed on admin leave or suspended during the investigation process? If not, will they be, moved to a different role where they don't have any interface with the subject, with the survivor of the complaint or any other clients for that matter? What are the ongoing risk mitigation steps that we can put in place to ensure minimal contact between the victim, between the survivor and the subject? And this can be, especially in camp settings, something that we do have to action relatively quickly. Living quarters can be close, and we want to make sure at the end of the day that the survivor feels safe to move forward in this with the investigation. The third is confidentiality. We try to impress upon all staff that should there be an allegation of safeguarding violation, the subject should not be informed. Sometimes it's very, we find that, country programs may move very quickly to address a violation with the subject to put the allegations to them. And we ask that they do not do that for the safety and security of the survivor, and ensuring that there's no retaliation or that the subject doesn't try to influence any potential witnesses. We also state that we prefer that an interview not be conducted until we have an investigation team formed locally or remotely, and risk mitigation measures have been discussed and implemented. The circle of those made aware of the case should be as small as possible and only on a need-to-know basis. And I'm sure many of you can relate, that becomes extremely hard when you remove someone from their workplace environment. All of a sudden the chatter starts and people try to find out what has happened. But we really make every effort to ensure that confidentiality, and we do impress upon people that a breach of that can result in disciplinary action. At all times, the names of the victim survivors should remain confidential for their own protection. The fourth pillar of the investigation cycle is the donor implication, defining the donors impacted by a particular allegation. And this also is considered during our weekly case intake meeting. We consider, for example, which donor is funding the subject's salary, which donor is funding the services provided to the clients. A copy of the donor disclosure is sent to relevant stakeholders, senior stakeholders, to share with their local donor contacts where it's applicable. Then we move on to the actual ECU investigation, which is the most time-consuming, obviously, and that's pillar E. It's, like I said, we do try to action safeguarding investigations very, very quickly, but, we can never assign a time frame because we just don't know the access that we'll have to information and how that might go. But some of the things that we consider during the preliminary assessment phase is the subject affiliated with the IRC? We obviously conduct a lot of joint programming all over the world. So sometimes we get cases where the staff member may come from another agency or another INGO. And if that's the case, we have a formal referral process, and we will, because it is impacting our clients, we will keep abreast of that. We will review their report. We will ensure that the investigation was thorough, and the findings, the evidence that has been collated underpin the findings and seen to be the correct course of action. We consider whether the survivor is a direct IRC beneficiary, an indirect beneficiary, or a member of the local community. Having said that, even if it is an indirect beneficiary or a member of the local community, we weigh it in the same serious manner and hold subjects accountable in the same way. We assess the vulnerability of survivors, their gender, any disability, their age, whether they belong to a minority group. And in that assessment, we consider the magnitude of harm and the impact of that on the survivor as part of our triage. We also consider, is the survivor aware that the allegation has been reported and have they provided consent? This is very important because we will not move forward without that consent. The next point is, do we have the contact details for the reporter or the survivor to obtain additional details, or is there other ways that we can get that information? We consider what the potential impact is to the reputational impact to the organization. We consider, is there evidence that needs to be secured immediately? Sometimes it could be just phone, WhatsApp messages that might give us what we need insofar as evidence. And also, last but not least, is what are the relevant national laws that we need to be aware of? Labor laws, criminal laws, in the case of minors, for example. Do we need to refer this to law enforcement? In this instance, and it does happen quite often, where it will be referred to police with the consent of either a minor's caretakers or an adult client, we will not conduct a parallel investigation. We will ensure we will obtain the name of a focal point within that body and keep in touch with them, ensure that we receive updates, make sure the matter is being progressed, and obtain a copy of the findings, either verbally or in writing, so that we can share that with senior management and donor if it's applicable. Sometimes also local labor laws dictate that there has to be a tribunal held, like for example in Uganda, before any disciplinary action is taken against the subject. So that's something that we consider as well. The second phase under ECU investigation is the investigation plan. And this is basically a roadmap for those of you who haven't done one before of what action will be taken insofar as progressing the investigation. We define what IRC policies and procedures have been violated or local laws if they apply. We determine the scope of the investigation. How long do we believe this misconduct has been going on? We determine who should be interviewed in order to progress the investigation. We consider the limitations in conducting the investigation, and also the objective and timeline in relation to the investigation. Then the third step, we move to the full investigation. Given the sensitivities and security risks involved in investigating safeguarding violations, besides the risk mitigation steps that we may take at the onset of receiving the complaint, before we conduct interviews, we conduct a risk assessment for each case matter so that we understand what the dynamics may be and any dangers posed to the participants of an investigation. So with regard to the response risk assessment that we do prior to interviews, we consider, for example, as you all know, safeguarding investigations are very interview heavy, given often the only evidence we might have is the accounts provided by other people, whether they've been indirect or direct witnesses. But in each circumstance, these can pose different risks. So we want to make sure we understand all of it before we approach anyone. Like, for example, for interviews with witnesses, and often these are community members who might have been privy to the misconduct, as I mentioned, either directly or indirectly. But we would consider the risk the victim or the survivor would face if we were to approach these community members. For example, blame, rejection, stigma. Are there any safety concerns? So we don't just go in and start doing interviews without really assessing that, and also making sure that we understand from the survivor perspective what they are most comfortable with. With regard to the interview with the subject, we consider, you know, the risks again to the victim survivor. If the perpetrator is faced with the allegations, and is there a chance that they can identify who submitted the complaint or who is impacted, and will that also result in further harm to the survivor? When we interview the survivor or caregiver, as I mentioned before, we employ a survivor-centered approach. We obtain the consent to move forward with an investigation or to receive support services. And I will go into greater detail on this very shortly. There are several important considerations for safeguarding investigations that differ from other types of investigations we conduct. The first is balancing between obtaining information and the welfare of the victim, survivor, witness, whistleblower. As I mentioned earlier, the welfare, particularly of the survivor, is paramount. So if pursuing an investigation or an avenue of inquiry is going to cause further harm to them, we will readjust. Two, we ensure gender balance when and where possible. Like so many INGOs and other agencies around the world, we do have resource limitations, but where we can do this, we do it. Three, we enlist the support of a translator. And I want to emphasize translator, not interpreter on the ground, because it's extremely important that whoever we enlist to speak on behalf of the survivor provides a direct translation, including any local slang, including any veiled reference to sex, so that they really do understand and relay exactly what it is that the survivor is trying to communicate to us. We build rapport and trust. We employ a trauma-informed approach. And when I say trauma-informed, by that I mean we seek to obtain information from a victim survivor whilst considering what the effects of trauma may be and how it can play that requires a different lens. For example, trauma can impact memory. It can impact behavior, reactions, someone's disposition. So the analysis of these accounts need to be nuanced, as does the approach, and we do consider that. We aim to interview each participant once, again, you know, so as not to re-traumatize them. And that can be even for key witnesses in a safeguarding matter. The initial interview with the victim survivor, you know, I wanted to lay out for you exactly how we approach it because I thought it might be helpful to get into some detail on that. First and foremost, we introduce the investigation team. You know, once we have received that consent to move forward, and clarify the purpose of the interview. We assure them of strict confidentiality. We obtain an understanding of their current needs because things may have changed from the point of having received the complaint. And we want to make sure that to move forward, if they require any assistance or they have specific needs, that we are, you know, if we can accommodate them, that we do. For example, there are instances where for the security or safety of a survivor, if we're going to be interviewing or speaking to them or providing them support, that we may meet with them off hours, that we transport them in unmarked vehicles, that we meet with them at a remote location. We do try to understand what their particular circumstance is, particularly in terms of their safety, so that we adjust our approach. Fifth, we offer support services, including but not limited to psychosocial, medical, health, economic, or legal support services. But again, we receive, we seek to obtain consent before making any referrals. We discuss any ongoing safety and security concerns because this, like their needs could have changed from the onset of the complaint being submitted. So we want to make sure we're able to address them. We provide the contact details of a local focal point, a GBV or a WPET member protection specialist, should additional concerns arise. We explain the investigation process, including realistic timeframes and potential outcomes. I think this is very important. Getting an understanding of what they would consider justice or what they would like to see materialize from the investigation, but also providing them an understanding of how it will go and what potential outcomes there may be. We also inform them at any point if they are uncomfortable with any aspect of the investigation or the investigation process, or have additional fears, that they can withdraw their consent. Interviewing minors. This is something that we try to abstain from because of the tremendous burden it places on a child. So we often just deal with their caretakers. But if we do have to interview a child for any reason to obtain additional details, we would not do that ourselves as investigators. We would enlist the support of a child protection specialist where available, so that they can adapt the presentation to meet the capacity of the child survivor. If it's important to remember also, when interviewing minors, there's an increased risk of providing pleasing answers to suggestive questioning. So that's the other reason we prefer to work with a technical expert. We are not positioned to be able to read those answers. And we always obtain consent from the caregivers unless they themselves are implicated, and then we have to readjust in terms of how we would approach this. The age of consent and assent differ depending on stage and maturity of the child. And so this is something that's a bit, again, more nuanced. I mean, typically caregivers are responsible for giving consent for their children, but in some settings, older adolescents are also able to provide consent in lieu of or in addition to their caregivers. So this is informed assent. So it's their expressed willingness to participate. And this actually can apply to kids as young as 6, where they can provide their informed assent. Again, once we've determined that they understand the questions that might be posed to them and understand the services that might be available to them. And that will go through from age 6 through 17. 15 to 17, the assent could even be provided in lieu of consent or assent from their caretakers. We evaluate them generally on a case-by-case basis. The last phase of the investigation life cycle is reporting. So this includes the preparation and issuance of a confidential final investigation report for relevant donor and senior management stakeholders for decision-making purposes. A typical investigation report contains background, allegations, findings, the evidence that underpinned the findings, the conclusion, risk mitigation steps that we took at the onset of the investigation, and recommendations. So even though we might recommend disciplinary action or the termination of a subject, at the end of the day, that's really up to senior management how they move forward with that. In safeguarding matters, though, when a subject has been terminated due to a substantiated allegation, we make sure they're recorded in our case management system as ineligible for rehire, so that we can prevent this person from moving on to another entity and causing harm again. I wanted to end this presentation with the common limitations that we often see in safeguarding cases, simply because I think it's a great point of discussion for this larger group, and I would be really interested to learn more about how other agencies and organizations are managing these very common obstacles. The first being anonymous complainant reporter, where I said that, as long as we have a way in which to correspond with them or obtain additional details, we can progress an investigation. As often as we might get that information, we also don't, and we may not have a way to communicate with them, but, sometimes the allegations seem credible, or we're just concerned of the risk involved if we don't pursue a course of action. The second is the inability to locate the victim survivor. This happens a lot because of the transitory nature of our programming, where there's a lot of movement between borders and camps. That's another challenge that we face. The third is a lack of consent from victim survivor and or their caretakers. Again, very tough when you have a credible allegation and it's something that really warrants serious action. Fourth is the inability to identify or interview witnesses, given this, sometimes we can't interview witnesses in a community because we just don't have names or identities. In other instances, we can't approach them because of the sensitivities and the fear of reprisal to the survivor. The fifth is the lack of direct evidence or corroboration. As I mentioned, safeguarding violations, investigating them is a very, very different beast than other types of misconduct we might investigate, and we often only have the accounts, direct or indirect, often indirect, of witnesses. And the last is local labor laws that dictate a tribunal or hearing if disciplinary action is to be taken against the subject. This always puts the survivor or even key witnesses at great risk. So that's a balance and a big challenge for us as we're moving forward. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time and attention. I will now turn it over to Tom.
We can all see you now on the screen. And I also want to welcome Dr. Hasan Mutashami, who is the country director and representative of UNFPA in Turkey. Welcome, Hasan. So thank you very much, Samira, for your presentation and for staying within the time limit. I'm checking with my colleagues if there are questions. I have not received any question in writing so far. So what I will do then, I suggest we open the floor for questions. We have 10-15 minutes for Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand. And when you're given the floor, I would be grateful if you could quickly present or tell us who you are and who your question is directed to. You can also, although Robert and Hasan have not spoken yet, if they feel that they are well placed to answer the question, please jump in. So the floor is open, colleagues. Or if some of the other panelists want to complement or make some remarks, please go ahead as well, because I don't see any hands for the time being.
Maybe Tom, I can...
Yes, go ahead, Daniela.
I just want to say thank you to Samira, first of all, for her presentation and also for having very correctly point out on the number of limitations. I think for all the elements that you have mentioned, Samira, maybe we could have a separate webinar and explain and complement and experience, share lesson learned also issues. One element that I might like to mention is when you made reference to the consent. Which is extremely important, is crucial to undertake an investigation. However, I can say, for instance, when you were asking how the other agencies are also doing, sometimes, at least from UNHCR, I can say that there are different times when the consent comes up. And for instance, some UN agencies, including UNHCR, there is an obligation to report, even a suspicion of a PSEA. So that means even when there is not yet a consent, but of course the report is to the responsible investigative entity. And there is also no limitation in terms of age. Then of course, when it comes to the competent investigation entity, like in your case, you in your entity, then the consent discussion starts, and no investigation indeed starts unless there is a consent from the person. So maybe there are different ways that I'm looking at. I'm not saying which one is the best. I think as long as it's respected, as you rightly say, the centrality of the survivor, I think there's also the importance of reporting to make sure that there is no zero tolerance. Maybe another thing that we can discuss further later on is also how to obtain the consent.
Yeah.
And you very rightly also mentioned the word trust. And if we've been investigators, we know that it takes some time to build the trust, and also some time to give the consent sometimes. So in order to fight the impunity. So these are interesting things at different scales, but I just want to share, waiting for other colleagues to raise their hands, and maybe the importance of these two elements. Thank you again, Samira.
Thank you, Daniela. And it's true. And we've had instances where we get the consent and then they withdraw it, or or they don't give the consent and then they change their mind. So yeah, it's a constant. I think it's just about keeping the communication line open.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniela, for your intervention. We got a question for Mirza in the meantime. It was written in Turkish, so our colleagues from UNFPA translated into English, because my Turkish is not well enough yet. So Mirza, a question for you.
Yes.
If the sexual exploitation and abuse occurred in a public institution, and when the case was brought to the court, the acquittal was given on the grounds that the allegations could not be proven due to the delay of the complaint. But if the truth of the case is understood, and when the details of the case are examined, how can you proceed, or what can you suggest in this case? So if I understand well, this is about a case that was brought to court, but it was not, I have the impression that the person asking the question is saying that the case could not be handled because of a prescription of the case, I would say, or delay of the complaint, although it was very clear what happened. So what can you suggest in such a situation?
Yes, because we don't do criminal investigations, we do administrative. What we might do in that instance, if it is implicating our staff member, then we take it upon ourselves to do a review of or an investigation. We're careful not to do a parallel investigation if another one is happening, but we would maybe do our own review, and then we take action from our perspective, disciplinary action against the subject, and record them as ineligible for rehire. I don't believe we can do more than that, and offer obviously whatever support services we can to the survivor.
Thank you, Samira. I don't know if Daniela or Robert, who are also working, who have experience or had experience or are still working in this field, have suggestions or cases that they came across, similar cases. Daniela, please go ahead.
Just to say, Samira did already mentioned the most important things, which is indeed the difference between the two levels of investigation. It may not be evident to everyone, but indeed administrative and criminal. Sometimes it is difficult to establish in evidence when a certain period of time has passed. But that doesn't mean, as Samira mentioned, that we should not always report, and people can report at any time. But it is true that sometimes it's difficult to find some evidence after a certain period of time. And as well as, unfortunately, although we conduct administrative investigations, sometimes we are expected to identify certain evidence stronger in order to support, for instance, tomorrow a dismissal decision. That sometimes some UN tribunal has been expecting in the past some more precise evidence, let's say. But I fully agree with Samira. One does not exclude the other as long as they're not conducted in parallel. At least in my experience. Over.
Thank you, Daniela. I see that there was another question, but it was not complete. It was again, what if the victim gives up? Is there anything else that can be done if we are aware of the case?
We may decide still to take action against the subject, even if we don't do an investigation, if we have enough detail and it's credible in the initial complaint. that has been done as a risk mitigation measure.
Thank you, Samira. And I would like to ask Hassan, Robert, and Daniela, who are working for the UN, what if we know about a case, but the victim, for whatever reason, gives up or does not step forward, but we all know, or the supervisors or the organization knows the facts for sure. Is there anything that can be done in that case? Thank you, Hassan. And the questions keep coming. We still have a few minutes before we move to Robert's presentation. Another question that we received is a very interesting one. I mean, it's something that I've been confronted with as well in my work, but not related to PSEA, but also in protection matters. What has been a lesson, or can any of you share lessons on working with interpreters when investigating these cases? I mean, I had to deal with that when I was interviewing prisoners of war, when I was working for ICRC, and you deal with an interpreter, or when you are interviewing asylum candidates, asylum seekers as well, for which you need an interpreter, which is also a sensitive issue, but in the case of PSEA might even be more sensitive. So any advices on how to make sure that you have the right interpretation services or translation services, or tips that you could give?
Well, I think it's, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think it's very important that they translate directly. It's very important that they understand the local lingo slang, that they don't shy away if there's explicit detail provided, that they give it to us verbatim. And then also I would have a conversation with the interpreter beforehand to make sure they employ an empathetic tone, because that's not something maybe they think about, but given the type of case we're dealing with, I think this is very important.
Thank you, Samira. And any of the other panelists who wants to come in on that, or shall I move to the last question for this round? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Daniela. No. Please, Robert, go ahead, and then Daniela.
That's a very good point, Robert. I'll just add to that. We've had those instances as well. And sometimes we employ language support services, you know, like interpreters that we can just sort of patch in on the phone on speakers so that a survivor would feel comfortable that it's not someone from their direct community or in their location.
You're on mute, Tom.
Thank you, Robert and Samira. Daniela, did you want to comment on that point as well, or shall I move to the following question?
No, it's okay. Please proceed.
Thank you. So there was questions keep coming in. We will take two more questions now, and then the other questions we will handle at the end. One question was, is there coherence between the guidance and investigation procedures or principles between the International Rescue Committee and those of the United Nations? I think that's a very interesting question. And then another question, and that might be linked to the first one. Are there any particular procedures to take into account when the victim is a person with special needs? In particular, according to the question, somebody with mental problems. Are there specific procedure and guidance or standard operating procedures for investigation if we are dealing with people who have a mental situation? Who wants to take this question?
I can take, I think Daniela would probably be able to weigh in better on this, but, you know, having done some investigation consulting for the UN and knowing the two systems, I would say one of the main issues, I think, like IRC, International Rescue Committee, is employment by will. So we don't have the obstacle of a contract very often to deal with. Sometimes we do, but generally no. So there are not as many limitations or restrictions in that regard should we move towards termination of a subject with a substantiated allegation. That's one point. And I think, and then in terms of the victim with the special needs, that's something we obviously determine with a technical person's assessment. But if that's the case and we feel they cannot advocate for themselves or for their own protection or their own self-determination, we may consider moving forward with an investigation, even if we don't have their formal and verbal consent.
Thank you, Samira. And on the first question about how different or how equal are the guidance and on procedures between IRC, the UN, and perhaps other international organizations. I would assume that they would be I hope they would be pretty much in the same vein. But if one of you would know that there are big differences, it might be interesting to know. If that's not the case, then I would suggest that we move to Robert. Robert, before you go ahead, the organizers would like you to choose at the bottom of your screen the translation modus you want. If you go to the bottom of the screen, you will see share screen, raise hand, record, and then English or Turkish. So if you can choose the language that you will speak in, so that the translators can do their work. Do you see the bottom?
Yes, and I've already done that. I've chosen English, so they can the translation can be done in Turkish.
Thank you very much for that, Robert. So you have the floor. If for the sake of time and to allow some more questions at the end, and for Hassan also, Dr. Hassan, to have time to make the concluding remarks, if you could try to stick to 25 minutes. Maximum 30, if that would be possible. Then we will still have some time to take some questions and to take some more questions, and for Hassan to speak. Thank you very much. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to the panelists and the participants. I know introduction was done on my behalf. My name is Robert. I work with the Office of DSRSG, HCRC for Iraq. I've been working on PSEA for the last 10 years and in the UN definitely the last 14 years in different parts of the world, Middle East, Africa, and then partially Europe, and then of the United States. So I'll move straight to my slides. I hope you can be able to see the slides. Are you able to see the slides from your sides?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'll talk about investigation procedures, and my focus will be more in Iraq and also in Uganda, where the kind of approach we are using in both countries tends to be similar, and both countries, particularly Uganda, presents both humanitarian and development context. In Iraq, most of the operation is humanitarian, but we have now the element of development because we are making transition from humanitarian to development. So when it comes to PSEA, the flow, the way it flows, we have different ways or different channels which complainants or survivors or witnesses can be able to air their or to report, say, allegations, and of course, allegations beyond SEA. Some of these include the information, the protection desk. We also have the dedicated email, the endangered email, which you can see from your screen. We have the hotline number, which is free hotline number. We have the complaint and feedback boxes and also community-based engagements. So we have two levels. The first one is for someone to report any form of complaint, including, say, allegation. Then the second part is to make a determinants whether the kind of complaint meant, whether it is potentially SEA or whether it is general GBV or whether it is a complaint beyond SEA GBV for that matter. If it is a SEA complaint, the step which is taken is to seek consent from the complainant, that is informed consent, depending on the age of the complainant, because we have seen from Samira's presentation, when it comes to minors, anyone below the age of 18 cannot give informed consent. That is, again, according to the UN guidance. So for people above the age of 18, that is adults, when the case is determined to be a SEA, we have an incident reporting form where the information about the kind of complaint or the nature of complaints are handled. These are just preliminary information, not investigation or fact finding, but preliminary information. Then this information form, a password is encrypted to ensure that whoever is receiving is on a need-to-know basis and no one else has access to this information unless the person receiving is someone intended to receive the information. Now, once the information has been entered and the person, the perpetrator, that is the organization that has employed the alleged perpetrator is known, the information is forwarded by the PSEA coordinator to the end of agency that has employed the concerned perpetrator. The end of agency concerned initiates forwards the case to investigators based on the internal protocols or procedures of the particular organization or UN agency in question. The end of agency is also supposed to ensure preventive and responsive measures are put in place, including safety assessment, awareness raising, and also victim assistance. And on the same note, in a situation whereby even if the person, that is the victim, doesn't want the case to proceed, we normally, one, assistance has to be provided. That is, the victim is informed of the available assistance and referred for assistance. Again, the victim is also informed of mandatory reporting because all UN organization, whether mission, entity, depending on which organization, so long as it's a UN organization, we are obliged to mandatory reporting according to the Secretary General Bulletin, the core principles. So victims are informed of mandatory reporting. And those who want the case to proceed, then the details, that is the information are entered in the form. But for those who want the case to remain or not to proceed, then the case is forwarded, but they are left or they are kept anonymous. In a situation whereby the alleged perpetrator cannot be identified, the PSEA coordinator, in consultation with the relevant key actors, conduct preliminary inquiry, ensure safety audit is done, and gives support as needed to the victim. And then again, if the victim or the organization that has employed the alleged perpetrator can be established, then the same process initiated, as I've already mentioned. If the organization that has employed the perpetrator cannot be identified, then the PSEA coordinator, together with the coordination team, convenes an urgent meetings and also seeks support from ISC. That is, if the team believes further action is needed, and that the support of ISC is needed to be able to identify the organization that has employed the alleged perpetrator. These are the translation aspect of the chart, so I think I don't need to repeat that. I'll move straight to the elements of confidentiality, as I've already mentioned, whereby the reporting, that is the channel reporting say allegations, as I've stated, is done through password protected complaint form, and prior to recording, the complainant is informed of the mandatory reporting rule. And again, the victim is also informed of the procedures that the UN will take when the report has been received. So this is part of the informed consent. When you are seeking informed consent, all details are provided to the victim or to the complainant if the victim is different from the complainant. So consent, as I've said, is sought before sharing the complaint. If the survivor wishes to remain anonymous, the case is reported without revealing the details about the survivor. This is part of, that is what you call ethical dilemma, where you want to comply with the mandatory reporting, but at the same time, the survivor doesn't want the case to proceed, and we are obliged to mandatory reporting. So we normally keep the survivor details anonymous, so we don't provide details of the survivor. This is how the form looks like. Some of the details about the form include the name of the complaint, the nationality, the address of the person who is complaining, age, gender, etc. Then the name of the survivor, nationality, age, gender, all the way to the ways which the particular victim or complainant would want to be reached, whether through email, phone, or through a family member. Then the date of the incident, the time the incident took place, and the location. The reason why we normally consider the date and the time is because if it was say involving unprotected sex, then we have a chance to ensure the particular victim before the lapse of 72 hours can be taken to medical assistance. That is like for post-exposure prophylaxis to protect the victim from getting HIV, among other diseases, also for unwanted pregnancy, that is emergency pregnancy kit. This can be done within 72 hours. So time of the incidence is very key, and also the date. The location again helps us to do targeted intervention, because where a case has occurred, it means many more cases could be happening, because it takes a lot of courage for the victim or for the survivor to come forward and report a case. Then we also get the information about the alleged perpetrator, the organization that has employed the alleged perpetrator, position, the type of entity, location, among other details, which are key. Investigation process when it involves UN staff. If it is a UN staff or someone who has a contract with the UN, the case is referred within 7 days to the Office of Audit and Investigative Services. Some organizations have Office of Inspector General, others have ethics. So it depends which has employed, or the organizer that has employed the alleged perpetrator. But efforts are done to ensure the case is referred within 7 days. And within the same 7 days, the investigative unit is required to open the case, so that at least we shorten the delay. And again, this is also something to build trust of our mechanisms. And then communication is also provided through the same channels to make sure that the victim or the survivor is aware of what is happening and that their case has been opened. Investigative process involving UN, again, As I've stated, once a case, the investigation has been opened, the communication is done to end of office. And depending on preliminary safety measures, that is, perpetrator may be transferred or moved to another duty station. The reason is to ensure no further harm is done to the victim, because sometimes when the perpetrator is within the vicinity where the victim or the survivor is, this could compromise the safety of the victim. So after preliminary safety assessment, decision can be taken either to transfer or to move the perpetrator to another duty station. Investigation involving UN implementing partners. In a situation where the implementing partner lacks capacity to undertake meaningful investigation, then the UN that has contract with the implementing partner in question steps in to investigate the case. In Uganda, because of lack of capacity of NGOs, after we did PSEA capacity assessment of the UN implementing partners, we noted a huge gap in terms of investigation capacity for local NGOs. And what we did in Uganda, we deployed a CHS Alliance certified investigator to train selected NGO participants. The reason was to build a pool of investigators locally, and it is also something we are planning to do in Iraq. CHS Alliance, I'm sure most of you are aware of it. This is a common humanitarian services alliance. It's a body that provides trainings, and most of the CHS Alliance, they are perceived to be competent investigators who can conduct meaningful investigations. So NGOs with the CHS certified trained investigator can conduct independent investigations. But now what's important, they have to keep the UN organization that has contact with them informed of the investigation processes, including the outcome of the investigation. So that is the role of the investigator to ensure the UN agency is informed. When an investigation involves government personnel, this is a bit complex because we know many government organizations, they lack PSEA related policies. And as a result, this makes it complicated to
Robert, we lost you there. Your screen is frozen. Maybe the colleagues from Serenas can. Is it possible to disconnect Robert and to ask him to connect again?
Integrated harassment policy.
Robert, you're frozen.
Am I audible from your?
Please continue.
With the Prime Minister's office to revise the Sexual Harassment Act to integrate PSEA. The reason was to really strengthen or to have a framework within the government where perpetrators of government can be brought or can be made accountable, and the investigation can be conducted on them. This was something which worked positive and which was helping to mitigate challenges to do with investigating government personnel because of lack of policies and lack of laws which prevent PSEA from happening. But in Iraq, this seems to be a big problem. So we are still working with the SRSG to advocate within the government authorities to make sure that we can have some policies, some PSEA policies, and also we can build the capacity of government to become more accountable on there and to be able to conduct investigations for personnel or for their personnel. So another thing which I'm mentioning is about a situation whereby SEA, some governments have sexual engagement with minor as a law. That is, it's criminalized, so it's a crime. Of course, we know some countries like Iraq, it's not the case because they do permit marriage for people below the age of 18. But in a country like Uganda, it was a crime. Actually, having sexual relation with anyone below the age of 18 in Uganda is considered to be rape or it's defilement. So in a situation whereby government employees were accused of having sexual relations with the minors or with anyone below the age of 18, the UN in question was working closely with the government to make sure that the perpetrators were subjected or taken to the court of law, and that a case was initiated and support was given to the victim. What was more important on our side was to make sure that confidentiality principles were observed, assistance were given to the victim, and also the government was able to act or to punish the perpetrator and to mitigate levels of impunity, which in many cases the government, even their senior government officials, tend to prevail. And this works against the principles of protection. Investigation involving donor. In a situation where an implementing partner has a direct contract with a donor but has no involvement with the UN, because we are in Uganda and also in Iraq, we have seen a situation whereby the donors engage implementing partners directly. Some of the IPs are not UN IPs. So we work closely with the donors to make sure that in such a situation, then the donor has to insist of that investigation to be lodged by the implementing partner that has employed the alleged perpetrator. Sanctions. Some of the sanctions that can be deployed and which have been deployed before are done from the top level, the executive director, the director generals, or commissioners, depending on the organizations. And some of these include termination from work, demotion, or delayed in terms of step. Someone doesn't grow in terms of step. But as Mohammed mentions, the decision lies with the management in terms of the sanctions to be done or to be imposed on the particular perpetrator or the person who has been accused. And support is always given by the legal unit when it comes to sanctions. Yes, so the risk management has to be done during the process of when the sanctions are being given. This is to ensure no further harm to the victim and also to the perpetrator. So risk management are done. This is again done through ensuring confidentiality. The case is only dealt with the people who are supposed to know, and no situation whereby the case leaks out or is being discussed beyond the framework of investigators and also the people who are handling the particular case. So in some cases also the government or the UN hands over some of the employees, particularly when the PSEA case involved is a crime. So some of the UN employees are handed over to national authorities. For example, when it comes to defilement, which as I mentioned in Uganda is a crime. So if the particular perpetrator is a UN employee, then the UN, through the top UN official, in this case, I'm talking of the RC, who I was also advising in Uganda on PSEA matters, the particular perpetrator is handed over to the government or to the national authorities, and the rule of law takes place as per the laws of the country. Some of the challenges when it comes to investigations, I think some of them were mentioned by Samira in her presentation. This includes a situation where the victim wants to remain anonymous. This complicates investigations. Delayed opening of case, a lack of feedback from investigators to the victim, explaining the status of investigation. This tends to be a big problem. It also weakens the trust that our mechanism or the communities and everyone has with our mechanisms. The fear of retaliation is also another challenge where witnesses don't want to come forward because they're afraid some retaliations could be imposed on them. Cultural related issues whereby the case, that is culturally, we have seen a situation whereby where the case involves a minor and an adult. You find in some community cultures, the perpetrator is requested to marry the particular minor as a way to settle the matter. So this has continued to serve as a stumbling block when it comes to investigation, and is a challenge that within the UN family we are trying to advocate within the communities and also with authorities to make sure that we mitigate these cultural-related challenges. Lack of funds remains a problem where there is no enough or sufficient resources to recruit a company or investigator. But the beauty about it, we have the OCHA fund. So the OCHA has a rapid grant where this money is given to organizations to support investigation. And I'll explain to you in the next slide the way this money is assessed and who qualifies for the money. So some of the applicants who are given priority are those with a project that has been included in the humanitarian response plan, like what we are working on in Iraq now, or the refugee response plan, like what I was doing in Uganda. And then if, again, the applicant has received funding or is a partner of an agency that has received funding from the Central Emergency Relief Fund, that is the SAF, or the country-based pooled fund. So these are some of the priority according to applicants. What can the fund be used for? One is to contract investigative staff or to commission an investigation by a qualified company. Another use of this money is to reimburse a provider of investigative services where investigation is provided by a partner organization. And the third use of the money is to fund auxiliary investigation costs, which includes traveling, translation services in country of investigation. So this money is always available, and organizations can apply for the money, and this is one of the ways to support investigations. I think that was my last slides. I hope I've not taken more time than required, and I'm happy to respond to any questions or any further discussions where people may want some more clarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Not only for the presentation, which was very, very informative, but also for staying in the time allotment. So we have some time for questions. And questions, one question already came in and is addressed to you. It's more specifically about Iraq. Are there any statistics on the number of complaints received on an annual basis, average in Iraq? And what is the number of investigations? So how many complaints are there, and then how many of those are really investigated yearly, or maybe last year?
That's a good question. And normally for the cases that we have received, we normally put them in the UN system. So if you open the UN system, which is online, you'll be able to see the number of cases that have been received for Iraq, and also then the status of investigation. This is global, because normally when we receive a case, we share them also with the Secretary General, and that is the team that puts or maintains the website where cases that have been received in Iraq, like any other country, they are all uploaded there and the investigation status are there. But of course, for confidentiality purposes, you will not expect details about the case. It's only the numbers and also the outcome. So that one can be assessed online. I wish I had Googled that, but I can share that later on. The link where anyone can be able to click and find cases, not only for Iraq, but also other parts of the world.
Thank you, Robert. There are no other questions for the time being. Yeah, maybe more a comment, but somebody was informing us that maybe we should mention also, if one of you can, based on your experience, that maybe might be worthwhile to mention about a culture of silence in some countries, and the person mentions between brackets Asian countries, perhaps, but. So how do you go about that? I mean, is there a way to trigger this kind of if we know that things are happening, but to what extent is this culture of silence which exists everywhere, but in some areas of the world perhaps more than in other areas? Is there how do we deal with that?
Maybe I can come if you allow me.
Go ahead.
Yes, culture of silence remains a big problem. And this is one of the priorities that actually of the current Secretary General. If you look at the four strategies and the priorities for the SG, one of them includes encouraging the speak up culture. So what we have done, particularly in Iraq and also Uganda, one of it is to put measures to build trust of the reporting mechanisms. How do you ensure we build trust of the reporting mechanism? For example, if a case has been reported, we always try to engage with investigators to timely open the case and also to communicate to the victim through the organization that has employed the alleged perpetrator. So through strong feedback and complaint mechanism, that is one way of mitigating the culture of silence. The other important element is awareness raising. Awareness raising has to remain work in progress. You cannot say you have done once and then you keep quiet. You have to keep on engaging the communities, engaging staff, developing IEC materials, which are culturally sensitive or which are responsive to the culture, and also which meet the needs and the realities of women, men, of ONGs, including those with the disabilities. This is something which we are doing in Iraq. We are always revising our IEC materials. And also the other way of encouraging culture of silence, mitigating culture of silence, is through evaluating the effectiveness of our complaint and reporting mechanism. We have the U report. U report is a poll which UNICEF has taken custody of. And this through U report, we normally send bulky messages to communities. And it is through these bulky messages we are able to assess the effectiveness of our complaint and reporting mechanisms. So once we know what are the loose ends or what are the gaps with our complaint and reporting mechanisms, then we try to strengthen or to bridge the gap. This is one way of encouraging the culture of speaking up and mitigating the culture of silence. And then lastly, we have to work. We are working closely with organizations that have employed, that is both UN and UN organization and implementing partners, to make sure that they put preventive and corrective measures. This is why continuously we are doing PSEA capacity assessment of UN implementing partners in line with the 2018 protocol of say allegation involving UN implementing partners. So the reason why we do PSEA capacity assessment of NGOs is to minimize potential risks that could be hampered in different organizations, which could perpetuate the culture of silence. So these are some of the many interventions that we are deploying to mitigate the culture of silence, not only in Iraq, but also what I was supporting the team to do in Uganda. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. And in the meantime, a suggestion came to UNFPA came in, but I first want to give the floor to Eda, who wanted to intervene on this issue of culture of silence. Eda, the floor is yours. And please unmute and introduce you. Eda?
Dear Tom, unfortunately her mic doesn't work.
Yeah, so then it will be difficult. Let me share the suggestion that came in. One of the participants suggested or was wondering whether it would be possible for UNFPA, or I would assume the PSEA task team or the PSEA network, to organize a workshop on investigation processes with concrete or with case examples. So that means that this webinar really triggered even more interest than there already was. I'd also want to let you know, for those who haven't seen it, that we that we had more than 100 participants. So I think this is a very big success on this topic. So, but yeah, that's something to be considered by the PSEA task team, to have a workshop, a more in-depth workshop on investigations. I think that's something we should welcome. So before I give the floor to Dr. Hassan, you will have seen that in the chat box a lot of links have been shared. So I would encourage participants, before you switch off, before you leave the meeting at the end, to copy paste those links to the extent possible. But rest assured that the organizers will also share the presentations and necessary links with the participants. So if you don't manage to take note and then to put them down now, they will be shared with the attendees later on. So we're almost it's almost 4 o'clock, and I would like to hand over now to Dr. Hassan for concluding remarks of this extremely interesting webinar.
Thanks. Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. First of all, let me appreciate and thanks all the participants joining us in this webinar. Everybody, over 100 participation. It's quite rewarding and encouraging, and we appreciate you taking the time and being with us. I also would like to register my appreciation to Tom, Daniela, Samira, and Robert to be part of this panel and presentations and moderation and so on. The RC office and the entire UN system in Turkey is extremely passionate about the PSEA, and we take it very, very seriously. I do apologize for being a bit late. I was in another function and rushed to the office to reach this meeting as well. My apology again for being a bit late, not being at the beginning. And I missed the presentations by Daniela and Samira. Sorry for that. I will look at the presentation after this. The issue of PSEA, we discussed it in our previous webinar, how important and how crucial is for the entire management of the UN system. We have taken it extremely seriously. I believe it's past those days that people were trying to figure out a solution or finding a way to hide or skip the challenge. It's extremely serious for all the UN leadership, from the top level Secretary General to all the field offices and everywhere else. The zero tolerance is not something just a motto. It's serious consideration by all managers, all administration, all the structures at all the level. The difficulty came when it comes to addressing the issue with all the delicacy and nuances attached to it. But what I see as an administrator in the system, there are three distinct categories that can be, they can go in parallel and work together and harmony. But at the same time, it's important to pay attention to each one of them. One is that the services to the survivors. This is something that it's in SG's guidance note, bulletin, and it's there. And we know that one of the first tasks that we all should attend is to ensure full range of the services that are described in that guidance are provided to the survivors. That's one immediate consideration that can be taken into account. The second one is, of course, investigation and processing, the thorough analysis of this case and issue around it, and how to properly and comprehensively dig in and find out. While the investigation goes on, it's important also to attend to the third one, which I personally, as an administrator, I think it's important to pay attention to that. irrespective of the results of the investigation, managers have the chance to take administrative decisions. It does not necessarily mean that we have made a conclusion on any certain case, but at least it will safeguard the safety and well-being of our beneficiaries, which at the end of the day, we are here to serve them. They are the ones who pay our salaries. So basic administrative decisions to make sure that that, for example, a case that is raised and the accused is not exposed anymore to the clients and beneficiaries. This type of administrative decisions can be made with immediate effect without any implication on the issues related to accusation or investigation or things like that. At the end of the day, I believe personally, and I am passionate about the administrative decisions without implication of any. I know it's delicate. I know it's sensitive. I know it may have some consequences if the cases are channeled through different channels. But the whole point is that maybe be blunt on that. In medicine, we have a phrase when we do the training. We say, for example, this case seems to be TB unless proven otherwise. The legal framework, they say the accused is considered innocent until proven otherwise. In this specific case, I want to be a bit blunt on that. I think we should take cases as seriously and consider them true facts, because it's extremely difficult for survivors to come forward and say something or do something and claim something that with the culture, with the surrounding environment, and particularly in humanitarian settings, we should consider that as a serious case unless proven otherwise. And then, in other words, I'm recommending it should be considered guilty until proven innocent. In contrast to the legal terminology for that, but that's just an extreme explanation for that. The point I'm making is that administrative decisions are in our prerogative, and we can make those to make sure that at least survivors and beneficiaries are protected from these types of cases. And these three, administrative, investigation, and services to the survivors, should go hand in hand and should not wait one for the another one. That's my personal take on the response and approach to this. Again, thank you so very much for everybody to be around, and thank you, Tom, for moderating. Handing over back to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Hassan, for your closing remarks. And it was a real pleasure to moderate this panel. I mean, this webinar. Although PSEA is not a strange topic to me, I still learned a lot. So I hope that it was equally interesting and a good learning experience for the over 100 participants, which again I think is really a lot for a topic which requires some expertise. So I as well, first of all, would like to thank the participants to join, to stay online until the end, for the interesting questions. And I'm pretty sure that if people have more questions, they can always reach out to the PSEA task team. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Samira. Thank you, Robert. We're so happy that you managed, because we were a bit afraid that you would not make it, but so it was a relief to see that you could join. And thank you very much to Fatma and also Eda, who was not presenting for for organizing this webinar. So with this, I would like to, I can formally close the webinar. I wish everybody a good continuation of the day. And please don't hesitate to reach out to the PSEA task team if you have more suggestions, for example, this workshop or other questions that, that you really like to be answered. Thank you very much and see you at the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Thank you.